data-driven.
Hi, this is Data-Driven Q&A, and this is a long-awaited episode on systematic literature review. We continue talking to Alexander Kharlamov. Hi, Alex.
Hi, Ganna.
We are discussing how to do literature review in general, but in this series. But today we're going to concentrate on systematic literature review. Again, for those of you who haven't seen previous episodes, do have a look. We talked about master thesis, how to better organize it, where to start, what are the various components. Then we talked about literature review, traditional literature review. And now we will talk about systematic literature review. So Alex has a PhD in engineering, for those of you, again, who haven't seen previous episodes, and he has a very long experience in supervision, student supervision, as well as he knows a lot about literature reviews because he manages to do them very quickly and very efficiently, and the quality of his work is very high. So thanks a lot for doing this for us. I guess the first question to kick off our discussion is when do you need to do systematic literature review rather than traditional literature review, comprehensive literature review that we've discussed before?
Okay, so generally, systematic literature review is a methodology. Okay, so it's a methodology in itself.
Right.
Literature review is not a methodology. Okay, so literature review is something that is done for something else. So it's part of. Okay, so when you do an SLR, a systematic literature review, that can be the whole methodology of your thesis, for example, or the papers. You can have a paper with a systematic literature review.
Yeah. So, for example, at the moment, a lot of master theses are going to be systematic literature reviews due to COVID, because because of coronavirus this year, people cannot get primary data, so it's very difficult. And for various reasons, when you cannot just do desk research, when you need to go into the field, collect data, they instead have been now directed to do systematic literature review or SLR. We're just going to refer to it as SLR for the rest of the video.
And the thing is, there are many perspectives on what the SLR should be. Originally, the SLR came from the field of medical research. Its main purpose was to have a way to systematically review the results from different randomized controlled trials in an unbiased way, so you're not missing out on any studies. And it is meant to be a process that could be replicable. So you can give your SLR protocol to someone else, and that person should find the same set of literature that you did. And originally, the SLR was meant to understand what were the sample sizes, for example, what were the regions that those studies have been applied into, which were the limitations, the side effects, for example, the effects that they detected, the effect sizes, the type of drugs used. So those are very specific questions. And because the field was very, very broad, you could find dozens of studies and different trials. The SLR really made that process much more accurate. And one of the things that you really want in medicine is not to miss any potential problems and make sure that you're not replicating studies that you don't need to, or potentially you replicate studies in situations when it's ambiguous what could be the effect of certain drugs, for example. So the SLR gives you the ability to review the literature in an objective way. So it's a methodology in itself. And it has been brought into the field of, for example, management studies or humanities, because the field also is broad, and there is a limitation about what the SLRs can or cannot do. But generally, SLRs are great at answering the what type questions. Okay, so more descriptive, or sometimes how questions when it's about processes, but rarely they answer about why. Okay, so that type of question is very, very hard to answer with an SLR. Okay.
So normally you would have basically some idea of why when you do an SLR, or SLR is normally precedes, right, the actual work that you do on a particular topic that tells you why.
So an SLR can give you really good grounds to justify what could be the further research. And one of those questions will be, why does it happen? Okay, so you discover multiple whats or multiple hows in your SLR. And then you write your future research questions or future directions. They are justified, they're warranted because of your SLR. But then you can say one of the future research problems is to understand why this is observed. Okay, and this is a great way to use an SLR for. Okay, so you can graduate with a master's using an SLR. You can publish a paper in a reputable journal using SLR. So there are many good uses of an SLR. But remember, an SLR, for example, is not enough for a PhD because it doesn't make a contribution to knowledge.
Yes,
Generally, an SLR summarizes knowledge. Okay?
Yes.
So
yes, and I think I definitely saw several cases where people claimed that they did an SLR, but they actually didn't do it. And when you ask them, what was the protocol, how did you do it? So I guess the way I understand that the most important part about SLR, because you are following a methodology, like you said, and a protocol, it has to be completely replicable. So in the sense that if you conducted an SLR, if I get your protocol, then I should get exactly the same output, right? And that's kind of what doesn't happen sometimes. When people didn't follow this process in the correct way. Is that correct?
Yes, exactly. So the SLR is designed to minimize the researcher's bias. Okay, so and by bias I mean, for example, you read what you like, or you read only what interests you.
Yeah, and I think we all would agree that our, field of study, the way where we studied, right, our supervisors have a lot of effect on what we think is correct, right? And that's not always the case. Like, for example, in my field, kind of stochastic choice modeling, there are many models and there are convictions, like there are groups. So some people only, clubs, yes. So some people only prefer one model to the other, or there are people who say that actually, there is no such thing as one model, and you need to kind of use a completely different approach altogether. So you would have different, like I said, different clubs, different camps, and you have to just kind of reserve your judgment until you have done enough research about the topic to say, I mean, this is definitely, this model could be applied here, or that model could be applied here. And I guess what you're saying is that SLR can help you on your journey to make sure that you have appropriate representation of each point of view in your literature review, right?
And the process is designed in a way that first you tend not to miss things. Second, you have a criteria for selection. You have a criteria for quality control. You have a criteria for what you are going to read and extract, so extraction criteria, and then synthesis. So the SLR is designed for that.
So are we going to look at an example now of an SLR, and some practical? You're gonna give us some practical tips of how to do that.
So we will now jump into a step-by-step process. It will take a while because the process has many steps.
Yeah, I have to say that in preparation for this episode, we watched, I particularly watched quite a few videos on YouTube. They're all like 15-minute videos or something like this. So it's very high level. And normally do not give you any idea of how the process goes. I mean, it's very high level kind of steps. But so here we will try to provide you kind of in-depth view of how you go about each stage.
Yeah, and keep in mind that a proper SLR takes a long time. So if you set up to do an SLR, don't expect that you can do both an SLR and, for example, go collect primary data and then go build a model and so on.
It's like 3 months at least,
yes,
right?
Yeah.
I know for some PhD projects, people take almost a year to do proper SLR. Yeah.
So an SLR is the full thesis. And a properly done SLR will take you a long time.
Yeah, thesis, master's thesis.
Yes,
I
a
mean,
master's
PhD
thesis.
is not
No.
like we said before,
exactly.
it's not
but
enough for PhD.
You can actually use the SLR as part of your thesis for the PhD. So it can be one of your chapters.
Yeah.
And it's a great way to do a PhD. So anyone who is doing a PhD and is starting and they're thinking about how to approach this, how to start even the problem, do an SLR. You know,
I think another thing where it's very helpful is narrowing down your topic. That SLR helps a lot because normally the big mistake that a lot of people make with PhD dissertation is they grab a topic that is too broad. Similar it can happen for master's dissertation when the student decides on their own topic, and when you do this literature review in systematic way, you actually can say, okay, maybe this branch is not very interesting, maybe this branch is not very feasible, but maybe this is the route where most people went, and I want to do kind of one iteration on what has been done before, or these are the routes that different people took, and I want to take a completely different approach to the same problem.
So from this perspective, imagine if you're starting your PhD and you need to justify your hypothesis, or you need to justify your research question, or you need to explain what the research gap is, an SLR is the perfect tool to do that. Okay, because you can have a really high quality and make sure that you're not missing out on any field in setting up before you develop your methodology, before you develop your the rest of the thesis, before you actually do the work.
Hypothesis.
So if you want to have a really high quality literature review that justifies what the gap is and what the questions are and what the hypotheses are, the SLR is just perfect for that.
I think that we should also kind of explain that by gap we mean normally the how you set up your thesis or dissertation is you need to find a gap in the literature that you will be filling with your work. And so that's by gap we mean that. So this is and SLR is a great way to do that. Okay, so can we go into into the example?
Okay, let's jump into the example. Okay, so this will be the step-by-step process. Okay, so the first point here is that the literature review must be critical, and it's generally either a starting or the ending point for most research. Okay, so generally it's a starting point. Okay, but there are some cases when you can have it as an ending. Okay, so the literature review is the foundation upon which the thesis is based. Your data will be analyzed and the discussion and conclusions presented. So this is the skeleton. This is the structure. Without the literature review, it's very hard to develop a thesis. Okay, so
but like you said, you are not just kind of reading and assuming that everything is true and correct. You are still conducting this critical overview of the literature. So it is important that you're not just getting a bunch of citations, grabbing them and inserting them into your paper.
So one thing here is that the selection, the critical analysis, the review process is generally a highly subjective process. Okay, and you can miss things very easily. So You can,
or ignore them, right? You can just say, okay, this theory is the best, and
or I don't want to know anything else.
yeah, I mean, we have, for example, in behavioral science, we have prospect theory, which is a good theory and works in many different situations. And you can't say that it doesn't. It does work in many situations. But I had students previously who were very passionate about this particular theory, and when you tell them that there are alternatives, they get very upset. And so when they would write a paper, or even an essay, they would normally exaggerate the contributions of that theory over others, other theories that probably worth mentioning as well.
And the thing is, if you ask two different researchers, or you ask them to do a literature review, and you give them both the same topic, most likely, if there is no protocol, no process, they will come up with completely different perspectives on it. And even if you give them the same body of literature, they will also come out with completely different perspectives on it. Which is both good and bad. But when it comes to rigor, this is potentially a problem. Okay, so, and thing is, literature reviews are very important. And if you look, for example, at reasons why referees reject manuscripts, over 50% is just because of the literature review section. It's just not good enough.
Yeah, I think I, as a person who referees for many journals, I can tell you that that's probably correct. I mean, the first thing I would do is properly read the literature review section and look for important kind of pieces of literature, and if they're missed in the literature review, I would definitely ask the authors like why, and potentially even ask them to go back and redo redo the literature review.
Yeah, and for master's dissertations, the literature review often is the weakest point, because often it's hard to read. It's hard to read and understand what you read, and students often misuse the literature review, and they either miss things or they focus on irrelevant things. So they don't really use the literature review part to provide the reader with all the building blocks that are linked to their aims and objectives, to their problem. And when you read their objectives, there is a disconnect between what they are showing in the literature review.
Yeah, so it's normally like I find that a lot of people just, like I said, do a quick literature search on Google Scholar, and then they just try to fit everything that they can possibly find, even remotely connected to the topic in the in this in the section. So it's not has nothing to do with proper literature review. Of course, it's just basically something that you found based on keywords, and keywords coincided with your topic.
Oh yeah. So, and within the literature review, the key problems are often the failure to place the study in a broader context, then the failure to establish the theoretical framework, then using old or outdated sources, because the field of knowledge and science is constantly changing. And something that was true, let's say, in the beginning of this century, is probably no longer true. And sometimes in highly technological fields, things change even faster. Okay,
yeah, I mean, even in history, people say, oh, it's history, it doesn't change. Of course, it does change, because there are new findings, new aspects of a certain, are found about certain events, or new context that is discovered by new literature. So that is extremely important, even for for qualitative work.
Yeah. But for example, in economics, up to a certain point, people were believed to be econs, or perfectly rational beings. They were not believed to be what we know today.
Yeah, so we all thought about human beings we all thought about human beings as rational, expected utility maximizers, but that
That's really not true.
Well, I mean, the recent research allows us to model people in different ways. I mean,
Yes.
you can still model people as rational expected utility maximizers with kind of assuming that they make some errors and things like that. But yeah, I mean, definitely there are new approaches that you need to discuss and you need to look into them.
Yeah. So things change, and make sure that whenever you use sources, you look at some of the latest development, and you also trace back to the sources, to the origin. So make sure that you are aware of what has been changing and what changed. Okay?
Yeah, and also I think the important part, I mean, the first thing that you should do, I guess, to check whether your idea has been implemented before by someone else, or at least, something, a very similar idea appears in the paper. It might be that they addressed the same problem, but maybe in a different way.
So another issue is that there is no critical evaluation of the literature. Basically, this happens when the authors just put in their paper or thesis what they found without any criticality, without any relating it, without any synthesis. They basically
like
just
a list.
Yeah, they give a list and they expect the reader to make sense of that list. Basically, it's expecting that the reader will do the synthesis and analysis themselves. And this is not the purpose of the literature review. The purpose of the literature review is to have a critical approach to the literature. It's to show the different points of view, contrast them, see where they align, where they don't align, understand what were the premises of those papers, etc. So the criticality is to comparing and contrasting different sources, especially different points of view. Then the other point is that the literature review is often not even relevant to the study. Okay, so
yes, that happens a lot.
Yeah, so and those are the top. We have other things like poor referencing. They don't cite the key sources. They simply miss things, or the literature reviews are too short or too long. It's too repetitive, or they just stack references. They make a long string of references, and there is really a few points made, and so on. And
yeah, I think it's very important to also point out that you don't have to cite everything that was done on the topic. It's very important to just select the relevant things. Yes.
Yeah. And this is to say that if we believe in scientific method, and we should probably, to be termed scientific, a method of inquiry must be based on empirical and measurable evidence subject to specific principles of reasoning. Okay?
Yeah, so that's exactly the keywords, empirical and measurable.
Yes.
So if you have a particular theory and you test it, it doesn't matter how you test it, I guess, in the lab or in the field, you need to definitely understand whether the theory works, and you need to have some sort of measurements along the way. So
yes. So this is a citation by Newton. Okay, so the idea is that we need to approach things from an angle that could be replicable. Okay, so it must be measurable and there must be evidence. Okay, now why would we do a systematic literature review? So the purpose of the SLR is to locate existing studies, select and critically evaluate contributions related to the review questions. So the keywords are here: critical and review questions. Then, like I said, the SLRs come from the medical field and they encourage the evidence-based knowledge development. Then the SLR process has been adopted to the management sciences as being replicable, scientific, and transparent approach seeking to minimize bias by systematically summarizing and extracting all the existing information about the phenomenon. Okay. So, and let's look at how we start this idea. How do we start this process? So the research is a journey in a universe of bodies of knowledge. So we have a very wide space. And as we start narrowing down, we, for example, focus on a planet. So this is, this example is the management research field, which is very broad. And
at
then,
least we've chosen a familiar planet.
yes, yeah, hopefully, yes. And then we start looking at understanding where the boundaries are. So we um, try to learning and changing in extreme context. We try to map the field, so we see where the different fields are, and we can outline, for example, Europe. And then when we start the scoping stage of that, we see the landscape. What are the seminal studies? What are the cities and the connection between them? So what are the main roads? You start to seeing the relationships between the topics. And as you narrow down, you will look at the towns within a defined area. So you narrow down to an area, and you see what is the exact connection between those papers. So you look at the towns and the roads between them. So it's much more regional, and that's where you start your systematic review. And the final contribution is that you typically find 4 or 5 researchers, which are, for example, villages in a very tightly defined area, that are the core to your work. So you find specifically where do you sit. So you narrow it down. And this process, step by step, needs to be documented. It needs to have a protocol, and you need to explain how you got there, so anyone else who picks up the protocol could replicate that.
Yeah, so I guess you go from the galaxy to the village, and you need to document your roadmap every step of the way.
So the roadmap. So, and the thing is, we live in a technological world, and we probably shouldn't rely on just pen and paper. So there are some tools that can help making your life a bit easier. So the typical structure of an SLR is: first chapter, introduction and purpose, the challenge. Okay, so it's always good to start with a challenge. Then,
can you give an example of? Can we just maybe talk about with an example? So what would be the challenge? What does it look like?
The challenge, for example, in operations, a challenge will be to minimize the mismatch between the supply and demand. So this is a common problem. It's something that anyone who works within operations probably somehow is concerned about. And if you minimize that gap, you also minimize the waste, you minimize the cost, you minimize the lead times, you maximize the customer satisfaction, you maximize potentially your revenue, and so on and so on. So basically, minimizing the mismatch between the supply and demand is the challenge. Okay, it's a big problem. So chapter 2 will be the scoping. You map your field. And from that mapping, you need to come up with several review questions. They are the SLR questions. And if in your introduction, you should have the problem or a set of aims and objectives, your review questions, they must be aligned to your objectives.
Right. So you're saying like mapping your field. So that's the field where you mainly will do your contribution, right? Is that correct? Or like what I'm thinking is, what if you are doing like really interdisciplinary work? What if like you are talking about several fields? Like for example, I work kind of at the intersection of data science, psychology, and economics. So would I be first thinking which field I'm making my contribution to, or maybe there are several fields where I'm making the contribution to? So how would I then go about this second step there?
So this is exactly why you do a mapping. So if you have multiple fields, they will show up on your map.
Okay, I see.
So the purpose of mapping is to identify which fields are you working within. It's not to identify which specific subjects, but much more the fields. It's broader. So you will have, for example, for behavioral and economics, you will have economics, behavior, psychology. They're big fields and they're interdisciplinary. So the map will show that. Okay, and most importantly, when you do the mapping, it's not so much about what's within your map, but where the boundary sits and what's not within your scope.
Okay. So what's outside?
Yes. So you're talking not just about what are you including, what are you looking at, but what are you not looking at. So if there is an area that seems relevant, but it's not within your scope, you can define it here. So you can really narrow down your work to what you are interested in. And this is the purpose of mapping.
Okay.
And out of that mapping, you come up with SLR questions, the systematic review questions. And they are the key. If you don't have the questions, you cannot have an SLR. Even if you have a perfect set of aims and objectives, that will not be enough to warrant an SLR. An SLR is meant to answer your review questions.
So, like for the example that you gave before, the supply and the kind of the mismatch between supply and demand and operations, what would be like a couple of examples of questions for SLR?
Okay, for example, one example will be what are the methods used to improve forecasting? What are the common forecasting methods? What are the common issues with forecasting? What are the ways to improve forecasting? Okay, so and notice they're all what type questions. Okay, so those are, I would say, easy ways to do an SLR.
So you're not asking why would you want to improve forecasting?
Exactly. So that's potentially out of scope.
Okay.
Or you can have a really nice question about why would we do forecasting in the first place?
Yeah, or maybe why do we make mistakes in forecasting?
Yes. So this is something that you will struggle to answer with an SLR. But if you ask, instead of why do we make mistakes, we ask
what mistakes
or what are the potential mistakes, or what are the sources,
what are the typical mistakes,
what are the typical mistakes. You can definitely do that with an SLR.
Okay. So the important thing, like, try to formulate the what or how, but not why.
But try to avoid why, and even try to avoid how. Because what is a descriptive type question? How is a process type question? It's a relationship. Relationships are much harder to define. Okay, and why, that's really beyond the SLR scope. You still can do it. It will be very hard, but it's really hard to do as an SLR. Okay, so the third part is the SLR process. So basically, you explain how the SLR happens. That's generally part of chapter 3. So the SLR protocol includes both the definition of the process, the justification. It has the outline of the review panel. And keep in mind that we will go into each one in detail next. So I'm just outlining what is the agenda for the next minutes. Probably an hour.
It's not going to be short. So, if you need a coffee, you probably
this is a good moment.
This is a good moment to go get it.
So the review panel is essential for an SLR. So this is the group of people who makes sure that you're not missing out on anything, you're not making anything absurd, that you know where to find things, you know how to follow the process. So the SLR panel usually includes SLR experts, data extraction experts, and subject matter experts. But
if you're a student, how does that work?
So generally, your supervisor hopefully is a subject expert. If the supervisor is not SLR process expert, you can definitely find one. There are some people who already did multiple SLRs, and they can
you can watch this video where Alex is telling you what to do.
But that's not enough to include me in the panel.
Yes, that's right. Alex cannot be on every panel, so if you send him requests, you probably say no to many.
But ideally people who have done this before, they can be SLR experts. And also, if your supervisor requested you to do an SLR in the first place, or you chose one, and the supervisor agreed, hopefully they will be the SLR process expert as well. So they can be both the subject expert and the SLR process expert. So they can have a double role. And generally, your librarian is actually a specialist in data extraction. The librarian is generally a role that must know how to extract data, so they can be your data extraction. So you can definitely have a chat with them. Help.
I'm just thinking that probably many librarians in the relevant universities will hate you now.
Yeah, but they know how to do it.
They do know how to do it. They are good person.
So,
They got good people to ask, and you should definitely ask them. But probably they're not used to being asked.
depends. Some universities use SLRs very often, so the librarians definitely know, and they will know what you mean when you go and ask them, I need you to check my queries, I need help with understanding which databases should I use, and so on. So it depends. And also, don't be shy, just go and ask, because most likely they will be able to help you, because actually that's what they do. That's why we have libraries and we have librarians there, so they know where to find resources, literature.
They are kind of these people who are spending time, like using the same analogy that Alex used at the beginning. They probably are people who are spending a lot of time at the space station and doing the handshake handshake sort of process between the outgoing team and the incoming team, or something like this.
So
they document all of this.
So another element of the SLR protocol will be the strategy, the search strategy. It's very important because it basically outlines how you go about identifying your search words, what are the steps, how do you identify the appropriate keywords, and so on. Then you define what is the selection criteria, how do you select the literature that you're going to read. Then how do you control for quality, data quality appraisal. Then how do you extract data, and then how you synthesize data. Okay, so quality is generally based, for example, on journal rankings or how good papers are in answering the questions and defining the approach and what they did. Generally, reputable journals will ensure that quality, so you can have an easy way by using some ranking that has been accepted widely. And then you have the data extraction form, which should be aligned with your review questions, and data synthesis, which is how are you going to summarize the information that you find in those papers. So imagine you extracted the data, how are you going to organize that extraction? So this is the data synthesis. Then after you have your protocol defined with all those elements, you have a section called descriptive findings, which is the statistics about the metadata and the studies. For example, you define how many studies per year, what are the journals that they came from, what are the different fields that they belong to, what are the methods they use. So you present statistics about those papers. Then you have another chapter, which is probably the hardest chapter, which is the thematic analysis, where you identify what are the themes that you identify in your set, your selected set. The thematic analysis must be aligned with your review questions, okay, and it must be based on the data you extract and synthesized. Okay, so if they're not aligned, it's bad. Okay, you need to go back and do it again. Also, you cannot change your process halfway. If you define the protocol, you should not go back.
That happens, I think, a lot, kind of the reverse engineering of and the problem is, like, if you do it, it shows. It's like
it's
a little bit like blockchain, right? If you change something, then it's obvious to all the people involved in the process, and definitely in this case, that's true.
So it really is obvious when you find things that you didn't have any reason to find. So your protocol basically sets up the process of finding literature, and if suddenly you find something that doesn't belong, it's really obvious in this process. As well as after chapter 5, you have chapter 6, And this is an optional chapter. So you can have this embedded within your either thematic analysis, but ideally within your discussion and conclusions. But you can have as a separate chapter, which is the cross-thematic analysis and answering your review questions. You can have choices in terms of how you organize that, but generally that's before conclusions or embedded within conclusions as one section. Generally, master thesis relying on this methodology will have that embedded, but that just depends. If you have a really interesting analysis between themes, it's worth having a separate section. If you have some sort of framework and you need to explain that framework that was built based on the themes that you identified before and the relationship between the themes, also good to have a separate section. And most importantly, it's not an SLR if it doesn't answer review questions. If the SLR finishes without answering those questions, it's not complete. Because the SLR is built to answer review questions. So that's why it's important to have them in the first place, and that's why it's important to answer them at the end. So if you cannot answer them, you did something wrong.
Okay. So, but what about if you, like the usual excuse that you hear in this case that, oh, I just didn't find any relevant papers to answer.
So that means that probably you failed at mapping your field properly.
Okay.
Okay. You probably failed at defining review questions that are relevant. You failed at designing queries that are relevant. So basically, if your protocol and your process is poorly defined, then yes, you will end up without an answer. But if you follow a properly defined protocol, you will be able to answer your review questions quite effectively. And also, if you don't manage to answer your review questions after following a really carefully produced protocol, it means that you actually found a research gap. Okay, so you found something that doesn't exist. And if it came out of a really well-defined approach, and there is no way that you can dismiss that approach, you cannot say that something is missing and you show that to specialists and specialists cannot find anything wrong about it, then yes, you certainly came up with a really interesting gap. And that is a contribution. So basically you finish your conclusions with further research and you say, this was one of the objectives of my study. This was the question. I couldn't answer this question even following this careful protocol. This needs to be researched further. So this is further research, further work. Okay, and this is great to set up questions and future research problems and set up, for example, your scene for your doctoral work further on. Okay, so
but that happens rarely. We need to say, like, if you think that, okay, you know, I'm just now going to go and do this all these steps and follow all this process and find the gap, that happens very rarely.
Yeah, exactly. But the thing is, if you found a gap, most likely your protocol is bad. Okay. So don't assume that if you cannot find anything, you have a discovery here or you found a problem or a gap. No, probably your protocol is bad. But sometimes, rarely, you actually found a gap.
Yeah.
Okay. So careful about that. And also, if you did all that and you have no answer and then you show that to someone who is a subject expert and they just told you, you probably missed this. And here's a whole field that you probably didn't look at, and they actually answered this. Then you don't only look bad, at the same time, you just showed that you didn't do a competent SLR. Okay.
Yeah.
And this is why you have a panel. So this is why you need a review panel that has at least one topic specialist, okay, subject expert. Okay. So tools. Okay. It's
now we come to Alex's favorite Mendeley that he insists that everybody uses, and there is often a struggle because normally some of your co-authors use it. I don't just mean Alex, but like mine as well. Some of my co-authors use it and some don't.
Yeah. So the thing is, today it's very rare to find people who do references manually. And if you find them, they're probably very old.
Yeah, me.
Yeah, or very, very young. So yeah, anyone.
Crazy. And have a lot of time on their hands.
Yes. So yeah, thing is, the reference management software makes your life much easier. It can keep track of your references. It can keep track of your articles. You can organize your PDFs. You can change the reference style of your paper or thesis by just clicking into in a different style, and it automatically populates all the fields. So you can have really high quality referencing with the software at a really low effort. And there is really no excuse to do references manually, because imagine that you're writing a thesis and you didn't check carefully what is the reference style, because there are multiple styles. There are, for example, APA, Harvard, Chicago. And suddenly your supervisor reminds you, did you use Harvard style? Or they actually point out when they look at your manuscript and tell you, yeah, but this is not Harvard. This is APA. I need Harvard. And then you spend a week changing all your references. You don't want to do that.
Yeah. For that, for that reason, actually, Google Scholar is actually quite good. If you're doing that manually, you can just copy paste.
Yes, but then you cannot change it.
Yeah, you have to do it. You cannot change it automatically. You just have to do it all manually.
And if you're actually writing a paper, imagine that your paper didn't succeeded in the first journal you send it to, and you're sending it to a different one. That different one uses Chicago as referencing.
And you started
style.
with, say, APA.
Yes. So, and you had a different one. Let's say you had APA. If you use a software, you just click on the different style and it automatically changes everything. And within seconds, you are ready. If you are that unfortunate soul that is probably the research assistant or the fellow, you probably need to sit several days long changing all the references manually to a different style. So again, it's not only for master students, it's for anyone who produces academic work. Okay, so and SLRs really benefit from having this software because it allows you to have multiple folders, organize things hierarchically, rate them, give them stars, make notes, make annotations, highlighting, and so on. So it really helps you to organize your process. Some people like to print out everything and then walk with a little cart and drag kilograms of paper along, but that's really not efficient. And also some people love post-its and they like to have 1,000 colors of post-its in a big pile. That doesn't work really well with SLRs, not in this day and age. Okay. It might have been enough before when you probably went to a library and photocopied the papers you wanted, and then you had maybe 15, maybe 20 papers. But sometimes when you do a search in your favorite search engine, hopefully an academic search engine that gives you access to journals, it will give you thousands of results. It's unfeasible to do it manually. So use a reference management software because you can just download the metadata from those databases, import it into your favorite software, and then or shuffle and organize and make annotations in that software. And then when you're finished with selecting the key papers, you can append the PDFs, or even if you append it in the first place, you can easily manage the PDFs, the references in your manuscript, and all the metadata that comes with it. Okay, so it makes your life easier. Doing an SLR without software is hard. And it's the SLR itself is already very challenging, but without software, it's nearly impossible, at least a proper one. And Mendeley looks like this. It's window-based. It has a navigation system with folders. It resembles Explorer or Finder. It has fields for metadata. You can edit all of those. You can import, export. You can check duplicates, and you can find even new references because it has suggestions. And then you can filter, you can search, you can have customized queries. It enables lots of things.
I wanted to say that, Alex really insists on all his students, I think, doing using this system. And I remember when we met and started to work together, he also insisted that we use that for our joint papers.
Because also, for example, if you send your manuscript to your co-author, of course, it doesn't make much sense for master's dissertations because you don't have co-authors. But imagine that you're working with co-authors. They can quickly import your references into their software and work with everything you found. So that because all the reference information comes attached inside the Word file, the manuscript you send. So that makes life and collaboration much easier. And again, Mendeley is free. So even if you leave the university, your Mendeley account will stay with you. Unlike EndNote is a paid software. So when you leave your university, you lose the subscription to EndNote. So whatever work you did and all the papers you selected for your EndNote, you lose them. So keep that in mind. And again, the first question is why I'm doing this. So the purpose of your work, it can be expressed in form of managerial challenge in case of management, or a research problem. So what is wrong with the world? Okay. When you do map your field, you need to understand what's within your scope and what's out of scope. You define the boundary. And I can give an example. So this is my map of the field from 2013. And I was looking at operations research, supply chain management, decision making, analytics, and visual analytics. And this is how I mapped my field. It's basically the overlap of all those things. The scoping stage is to justify what your review questions are. Without scoping, it's very hard to define questions. And you also define sub-review questions. And the review questions, they should have this hierarchy. So just like we said, you have what type, how type, and why type. And the further you go into this hierarchy, the harder it is. So it is much harder to answer a why question than a what question. And it also increases the depth. So if you want to have a quick and easy SLR, you have what type formulation. If you want to make your life really hard, you have a why type question. And also, remember, your SLR questions, they need to be questions. They need to have some form of question mark at the end. If they're not formulated as questions, they're not questions. They're objectives.
Yes, I think we see that quite often.
Yes,
people just have statements.
Yes, they have statements instead of questions, and that's unfortunate because that's enough to bounce the dissertation back and ask for changes. So the panel ensures that you are not off your target and that you are doing something that is not terribly wrong. Don't expect your panel to know everything about your topic, but they are a really good place to start and to ensure that you are doing something with quality. The role of the review panel is to first approve the scoping, make sure that you are on track, that you are searching within the right area. They need to approve your SLR protocol, so you need to have their sign off. They give you advice. So often it ends up being extremely useful because the panel can recommend you papers that you are missing, so you can just add them directly. They are enough of an excuse to add papers directly without going through the protocol. So they can recommend you books, for example. Happens very often. They can recommend you book chapters. Okay, and often books are not included in the SLR process. It's very hard to use books as a source.
Yeah, I think the important point to mention here is that panel doesn't mean that it's a committee. I mean, sometimes you would have people who meet and know each other, but a panel just generally means kind of a selection of individuals who help you. And normally the approval, at least at master's level, happens at the level of your supervisor. That's probably the person who would approve that. But I mean, you can involve other people like your librarian or maybe some other senior people as you consult them. Yes. So they are kind of members, quote unquote members of your panel. But in fact, like, it's not a committee. It's not like they actually sit down and make decisions.
Yeah. And also they are the people who will prevent you from advancing without having a proper protocol. Okay. And this is often not, I mean, you don't feel great about because they basically bounce you back and tell you that you need to read more or work more on your introduction or your protocol. or maybe your queries are not good enough. So basically, they give you more work, but this is very important because there is nothing worse than actually completing an SLR and realizing that you missed a whole field.
Yeah.
And also, they can help you resolving issues about inclusion, exclusion. When you're not sure about what is in, what is out, they can really help. They can help you setting up the quality criteria. Imagine you know nothing and you started searching and you realize that you have very few papers after you apply your quality criteria. The panel can actually tell you what is the reasonable level of quality that you should expect from a given field. If a field is very new, probably you need to loosen up your quality restriction. Or if the field is very mature and you find too many papers, they can advise you that you probably should look only at the best journals there are. So you look at the elite of publications. Okay, so they are very helpful in that area. They also can recommend additional literature, and this is very useful often. Also, the panel, like we just said before, is composed by 3 types of roles: topic specialists, systematic review experts, and information extraction specialists. And some people can have double roles. And you should have more than one person in your panel. Okay, so ideally.
Yeah.
In my case, for example, I can give you an example. I had 5 people in my panel. So I had multiple topic specialists. I had people who were specialists in the process, and I also had people specializing in data extraction. And they were all extremely helpful. They all read my protocol. They all read my SLR, and they all checked my process when I did this. And the typical timeline for an SLR, after you finish your scoping study, so basically you define your review questions and you start implementing your review questions, is the following. So basically you can do this within 2.5 months after the scoping. So total, probably the SLR takes about 3 months of work. But in reality, it doesn't happen really so linearly, and things end up being quite different. So you end up taking a very long time reaching a workable set. And you finish searching for your literature and you define your set quite late. And it takes time to get comments back from your supervisor, from your panel. So it takes time. So be ready to rush in the end, because often things don't go as planned.
So you constantly, or both of us, we constantly repeat the word protocol. So what does it actually look like? Or is it like a formal protocol, or is it just
Yes.
a plan? Yeah.
So a protocol is a step-by-step process that I could give you, and you could repeat my process. You could find the same papers and extract them. So parts of the protocol are your panel that we just talked. It needs to be an identified set of people. They need to be identifiable, and you need to have access to them. You cannot make up people who you don't have access to, or people who don't exist. So they need to be people, the real people that you can talk to and show their protocol. They need to be also someone who has the credentials to be part of your panel. So you shouldn't find your colleague Andrew, for example, to be your panel member. And Bob is probably not a great topic specialist. So yeah, you need really to have people who have the credentials.
Yeah. Probably don't invite your friends who you have a beer with every Thursday or something to do an SLR, to be on your SLR panel, unless of course they're all great data extraction specialists.
Unless they have the credentials to be so. Okay, so but just be aware of that. And this is an example of a search strategy. So it goes step by step and has several decision points. So you start by identifying the keywords. You form search strings. You select your databases. This is where you're going to search. You test your search strings. If it generates good results, you progress. If it doesn't generate good results, you go back and you modify your search and keywords. Then, assuming that it gives you good results, you can then go and see if it generates relevant articles. If it doesn't generate relevant articles, you does it generate both relevant and irrelevant articles? If it generates both, you probably need to refine your search string. If it only generates relevant, then no. So after assuming that it generates only relevant articles and not many irrelevant, you assume that it's good, and you can then go into the selection process. So you select.
Yeah, I think this. If you want an example of how it could generate both relevant and irrelevant, watch one of the previous videos where Alex showed us how to search for literature, and there we had an example where we had learning, which was not relevant keyword, but machine learning was a relevant keyword, and so that's kind of an example of where you could kind of, for example, imagine that you have like learning and machine learning articles as a result coming out of your SLR exercise, and probably you don't want to include learning. That means that you have probably done something wrong, defined the field in the wrong way, or something like that.
So if it, for example, generates both relevant and irrelevant, you find strategies or keywords that could define what those irrelevant articles are and address that specifically. For example, when you search for something strictly for engineering and you end up with lots of publications from the medical field, you can just exclude the word medic or medical or health. That, of course, has a cost. You might be missing up applications of engineering with it and domain. But again, you are doing an SLR. So as long as you acknowledge your search process and you're clear about what you did, most of the time it's acceptable, even because there is no bad process except for when it's not being documented. Okay, so your process needs to be, and your bias needs to be acknowledged.
Yeah, and also I guess like in any, think about this process as if you are coding and you're trying to then fix the bugs. If you documented what exactly you coded, how you did it and all that, then it's probably easier for you to go back and trace where the bug might be, instead of trying to kind of second guess it based on the result.
Yeah. So then comes the part where you select based on abstract, and you read basically the titles and the abstracts. You see if they are all relevant. Then you can process that list by reading the full paper, whether you need it or not, depends on your questions. Then you can use the quality criteria to have a cutoff of which papers are relevant. And then you can have the final list of papers that will be included in your SLR. Keep in mind that at this stage, you could apply the quality criteria based on the journal ranking right after you generate the final list of relevant articles. Okay, so you can apply that criteria and end up with a much smaller set. Therefore, you are reading much less papers, much less abstracts, and much less full papers.
Now I'm going to ask a question that you usually get from students at this stage is there a minimum or a maximum number of papers that you should end up with as a result of this process?
So you should have enough, and this is an answer that my students hate.
Yeah.
And you should have all of them that are relevant. Okay, so
all of them should be relevant,
yes.
But I don't think you can.
Should have no blind spots.
Okay, so but it's you cannot say that it's between 20 and 1,000 or something, right?
So if you want a statistical average about how many papers end up in an SLR type thesis, you will find something between 30 and probably 100. So you end up having those, like something in that ballpark, because more than 100 becomes really hard to apply your principles of data extraction and quality control and so on. Less than 30 is probably not enough. Okay, so something like that. And this is not to say that your reference list at the end of your SLR thesis will have just 30 papers. It will probably have 3 times that. But your core literature that you selected is much less.
Mhm.
Okay, so you have a set of core papers selected using a protocol. In your scoping and introduction, you can have many more references, and you can have things that have been found by snowballing, which is something that we discussed in the previous
One of the previous videos.
session.
There will be links underneath
Yes.
this video to previous episodes.
Yeah, but this is to say that your core literature, your list of papers that you include in your SLR process coming out of the SLR protocol will be a smaller set than the final list of papers that are cited in your literature review. Not literature review, sorry, in your whole thesis.
Yeah.
Now, keywords. This is something that will either make or break your SLR. So the best strategy will be to decompose the review questions into words. So what are the keywords that are featured? In my type, in my example, I had what types of visual analytics are used to support decision making in operations and supply chain management. So from here, I can identify three main topics: visual analytics, decision making, and operations and supply chain management. So those are the main key topics. So, and the sub questions are about each one of those. So how do I break that into keywords? So we can have multiple ways to refer to visual analytics. We can also have multiple ways to refer and talk about decision making. Exactly the same situation for operations and supply chain management. There are many ways to call that, and they appear in the literature in many forms. So here we look at the semantic clouds. So the field of operations and supply chain management can be supply chain, supply network, supply base management, demand chain, demand network, demand base, value chain, so on. Same thing for decision making. Can be decision support, decision making, decision system, decision process, decision framework, so on. And even more for visual
data
analytics.
science, similar,
Yes.
Machine learning, analytics,
Yes. So
etc.
people will be calling those things differently, but they are all relevant. And if you don't include variations, if you just use that term, it's not enough.
Yeah, and some fields are particularly difficult to navigate. For example, in economics, there is a convention that people use the same terms to define phenomenon, and if you use a different term to define the same phenomenon, you are punished. You will never publish your paper. But for example, in fields like psychology, which is kind of the kind of adjacent field, you very often find that people call exactly the same thing. I don't know, like 10 different names, same phenomenon, different name, and it's very difficult. It makes it very difficult for you to find the literature. So you need to just be mindful of these things. And again, this is where your panel would be, I guess, instrumental to help you.
And also, you come up with this keyword list by briefly reading your results from your search. So you can use a grounded approach and start with one keyword, then make a search, then find the first relevant paper that appears from that search. Look at all the ways that they mention the topic that you want to look at, then pick up those keywords, add them, make the new search, again read the first 5 papers that come up if they're relevant, find the keywords that they use, expand your search string, and so on, and do that until you stop finding new ways to call those things.
Yeah, but again, with your questions in mind, right? I mean,
Yes,
once you once you've answered, or you think you found the answer to your questions, I guess that's where you stop, because in principle this.
But this is not yet to answer the questions. This is to identify what are the possible
keywords. Yeah.
So this is not yet in the question stage. Okay?
Yeah, but still it should be relevant to the questions, right?
Of course, yeah. But if the topic is relevant to the question, the keywords that are relevant to that topic will be more than enough, right? So yes.
Yeah. So
so when you pick up this keyword list, and notice that you have the field and the list of keywords, and there are many. You can simplify those into something that the search engine can read. And you do that by using Boolean operators, concatenation, and different search strategies. So one important thing is that you need first to relate how each field will be linked, and then how each field looks like from a query perspective. The query is what the search engine reads. So here you can see I summarized all those words previously into a much shorter search string. It looks a bit more complicated because of all the Boolean operators, but this is a reflection, a direct reflection of the previous list. Again, note that I'm using, for example, within, and often databases will have different different conventions how they will refer to this operator, or and are often very similar and they don't change. The way that we use brackets and inverted commas and wildcards or any ending operators is often very similar. So you need to be just probably worried about the within or near operators. So some databases will have within, some operators will call it near, and so on. And there are other operators like not, or not or not nor operator. So the different variations, but they're quite exotic and they serve very specific purposes.
So these examples in this table that we're looking at right now, are they for Scopus mainly, would you say, or is
no,
it?
They can be used in ProQuest and Web of Science, Scopus. This is quite commonplace, this type of organization.
Yeah. Okay.
And when you, for example, apply those search strings, you can then have all the different databases. You can search for that search string, and also it's very important, you don't search for each field separately. You must combine them together, otherwise you will be getting a different perspective on each one, and then you will need to combine them manually. So in order to get the overlap, you should really combine the search string in one string. And here I search in IBI Inform, Scopus, and EBSCO. And each one gave me a relatively large number. When I combine and I filtered by article type, so I only selected, for example, journal papers that have been peer-reviewed. I excluded conference papers. I filtered only for English language articles because I will probably struggle to read anything except English. Yeah, and I did that filtering. I automatically removed 879 papers. So I was starting with nearly 3,000, and I got rid of nearly 1,000 just at that stage. Then I ran a duplicate check. I got rid of 25. So ideally, you shouldn't have a lot of overlap, but it often happens because the same database will be referencing multiple journals, and sometimes those journals are common. So then you go and you do some data cleaning. At this stage, I had about 2,000 papers. Then I applied the journal quality criteria. And in this case, I used the Cranfield ranking, and I looked at 2 stars or more. So at that stage,
Cranfield is Cranfield University.
Cranfield University in England. So then I got rid of nearly 1,000. So I ended up with another 1,000. And then is when I started reading on the title and the abstract for relevance. And further, at that stage, I was able to retain 66. And then I processed into the full paper review and quality assessment. So I assessed how good those papers were. I had to have quality ranking, and that ranking wasn't just based on the journal that it came from, but it was based on how well the paper discusses a certain method, for example, or how well they apply something that I rated. And then I got rid of 29, and I ended up with 14.
Yeah, so I guess this is also a stage where you kind of apply this relevance criteria to what exactly
Yes.
you're
Yeah.
trying to find. And like if one thinks about relevance is a very difficult concept to understand. I mean, this is actually the place where you do it. And also notice how Alex had, I mean, initially like 3,000 plus, I guess. So yeah, almost 3,000, sorry, 2,965 papers. And he condensed that to 40 papers. And that's kind of what the successful process looks like. If I guess another quality control point is that if you cannot get rid of many papers through the process, you're probably doing something wrong. And equally, if this reduction happens too quickly, if like on the first step you end up with like 5 papers, then probably you need to go back and look at your process and understand where it went wrong. So it's not like if you mind so with this process, if you came up with 3,000 papers and then only 5 of them are journal articles, and probably there's something is wrong. Yeah.
So often students complain that they have their query just gives them 30 papers, 20 papers. It means that the query is bad.
Right.
Okay, so they're probably not looking properly. Sometimes, rarely, the field might be so new that they are not finding the papers that they want.
Yeah. So, for example, high quality peer-reviewed journal articles or something that they're not finding, but they're finding some, I don't know, arXiv articles or
preprints,
ResearchGate preprints, conference papers. So that can happen, but again, this is, I guess, where you would consult your panel, right, and ask whether that's okay to expect.
This is a good moment to ask for advice. And this is where the panel can tell them, look, you will not find good papers in this area. You need to look at conference papers, and then there are rankings of conference papers. And there are rankings of conferences, so you can definitely find something that is publicly available and is more objective than just your own opinion about how good they are. So you can go about that. But the thing is, the important part here is that you can be very strategic about how you define your quality. So, of course, your protocol should be defined a priori, but the line that you draw about what is your minimum quality requirement, this is where you can actually go back and adjust it. Okay?
So here, like for example, in this in the picture that we're looking at right now, you applied basically internal university ranking, right? If you were to apply maybe some more kind of general country ranking, it would be even more restrictive.
Not
in
always.
terms of, for example, I mean, not necessarily, but so it often, I think, is more restrictive than university rankings tend to be a little bit more kind of friendlier to the faculty, in the sense that they would probably allow you to call rank journals slightly higher than they are in the national rankings, but let's just assume that that's the case in this case. It probably would be the case that you would end up with fewer papers in this case, right? Not 1,123, but maybe fewer.
But also, for example, imagine that you apply the journal quality criteria and you end up with several thousand still. You can make that quality criteria a bit more strict. So instead of using, for example, 2 stars, you use 3 stars or above.
Yeah, or like in, for example, again, in such field as economics, apart from like ABS rankings where economic journals appear, we also have Journal of Economic Literature that comes up with its own ranking, and there you just have kind of 1 to whatever 200 ranking, and you can just say, I'm only going to look at the first, 40 journals, like really top journals in the field or something like this.
So basically you can adjust your quality criteria to have a workable set. And here the main thing that I usually advise my students is it is better to work with a set that you can manage and have a really good, careful process and actually read everything than rush through several hundred papers and have a really superficial and poorly made implementation of your protocol. Because there is no glory in having multiple hundred done poorly. It's better to have a smaller set that has been properly analyzed, synthesized, and it shows that you actually read everything. And it shows. If you rush through papers and you have a very shallow and poor analysis, it shows in the next chapters. So be realistic about how much you can read. I will say that if you get a final set of under 100, you probably are good to go. If your set is less than 30, probably you are in trouble and you need to go back and readjust your queries or loosen up your quality criteria or some other strategy. And also note that here there appears another 3 papers from cross-referencing. Those papers were recommended by my panel. So I added them directly without going through this quality and filtering process. I added them directly by panel's recommendation. And this is a great way to add references or book chapters that you missed because you couldn't possibly find them because they were not in your databases in the first place, but your panel is aware of them and they can recommend you. And it's acceptable to add. So in my case, I ended up with 40. Now, databases. You need to justify your databases and you need to explain why are they relevant for your search. Also, you need to understand there is some overlap between publishers and journals. Okay, so
yeah, for example, like in forums databases, I mean, apart from maybe a couple of journals, probably not very relevant, say for data science,
exactly,
or molecular biology or something.
exactly,
yeah.
And you have specialized databases like what was the name? The PsyDirect? Or,
something like this.
Yeah, and it's specialized in psychology journals. You know, if your topic includes that, probably it's worth including that specifically. But you need to justify that you're including it because of your topic. And if you go to each one of those databases, they will be explaining, they will have a list of topics that they include, and you can use that to justify why is it relevant for your specific search. And also basic filtering. So when you do the first selection, it's very easy because you can use automated and you can use software to do that. So you can filter by article type, language, and duplicates. Okay, and the software can do it for you. So you can definitely have that process done within the same day. So you can find your list, you can filter it, and by the end of the day you have a workable set. So it takes only a few hours. And this is where having a reference management software really helps. So keep that in mind. Journal quality. There are many rankings. I'm using an example from Cranfield recommended publications, and this is one of many examples. So you have 4-star, 3-star, 2-star, and 1-star. And the idea is that the 4-star is world leading, 3-star is international, excellent. Then 2-star is internationally recognized, and 1-star is national.
Yeah, I think it's also important to have an up to date list because in many cases, for example, ABS ranking, for example, this is the ranking of business journals. Like several versions exist, and the new version is coming out every now and then. And the problem is that the journals drift. So if you have a journal that used to be a 3-star and all of a sudden became a 2-star, and your criterion is only to include 3-star or 4-star journals, and that journal all of a sudden is not going to be within your criteria. And so then it would be equally, you could have a journal that was new and for some reason was either not ranked or was ranked low originally, and then all of a sudden became. So, for example, if your criterion is to only, if you say you are in a very high, well-defined field, and you decided to only include 4 or 4-star journals, if you had a 3-star journal originally and it was promoted to 4 or 4-star, then all of a sudden it will be in your selection criteria set, but you're not considering it because your list is outdated.
Yeah, so you always use the latest version of the ranking, and don't assume that if your supervisor sent you a ranking, that's the latest. Always go back and check if it's the latest, because supervisors might have a version from 1982.
Yeah.
Depending on how
that
old
they
your
really
supervisor
treasure,
is.
because
Yes.
some journals that they like are highly ranked in that. Yeah.
Yeah, but things change. Yeah, so this stage you select some ranking. And this example is about Cranfield ranking. You can use impact factor. You can use the ABS ranking or any other. So when you read your title and abstract, you can have a much more intelligent filtering here. So you filter by relevance. And if you read your titles first, it actually gives you like a very granular high-level filtering, and you will get rid of a good part of them. And then you can go and read a much smaller set for abstracts, because abstracts are a bit longer than the title, so you can be a little bit smart and strategic here. So anything that is not clear, they really should be read at abstract level. So if you cannot clearly tell apart what's relevant, what's not relevant just by the title, read the abstract. So because you might be missing something. And after you read that, you should end up with something between 50 and 200, or maybe 100. But yeah, up to 200 is still doable. And remember that this set is the one that you need to read in full. And we just had a session about how to read papers. In full means that you probably need to read the introduction, the conclusion, and if your question is related to methodology, you probably should read the middle as well, or results.
Yes, so we will post a separate video on how to read properly. There Alex gave some tips on how to kind of minimize the sort
Effort.
of in the effort in reading, and make sure that you read it efficiently, read all the literature that you need to read efficiently and smartly.
And keep in mind, if you know how to do it, if you can apply text mining at this stage, so you can have a really impressive number of papers that you filtered, and you can work with very large sets, because this is all working with the metadata. And here we can apply statistical packages for topic recognition, filtering, clustering, and so on. So this is somewhere where you can apply something more than just reading it yourself. Of course, you need to control it for quality, and it needs to be as good as if you read it yourself. But if you know how to do proper text mining, you can definitely do it here. Now, when you read the full paper, you need to apply this quality assessment. So you need to apply the inclusion and exclusion criteria that you defined in your protocol, and you need to apply your information extraction. So you're basically filling up a form for each one of the paper that you read, and that form needs to be relevant to your review questions. When you do cross-referencing, you can that's what we call snowballing commonly. You can find relevant papers and books that have been missed from your search, but you can find them in the references of the papers that you read, and you can add them as an exception. It is acceptable, and your panel experts can also add some. So this is where you can introduce some new literature in your set. And some of the common selection criteria are language, the field, the type of publication, the research type, the paper type, and the paper quality. I just mentioned a few of them, but here's an example of the exclusion and inclusion criteria that I used. So, for example, I had relevance to the review question. So that was a specific set of questions. Then language. scientific field, I was looking at very specific field. I was looking at only peer-reviewed papers and some practitioner papers. I was looking at the research type. I wanted empirical papers, not conceptual papers. I wanted to have papers that have been published. So I didn't want any conference papers or working papers. And also I wanted something that have been rated as 2, 3, or 4 stars by the journal, by the recommended journals at the university I was doing this for. So here's my example. You will have yours. It might look similar, but definitely make sure that it applies to your field and your questions. So don't just blindly copy paste inclusion exclusion, because they must be specific to your work.
Yes, for example, in data science, conferences are probably important, and you need to include conference papers, because a lot of them would be peer-reviewed papers. Equally, in some subsets of engineering, for example, IEEE conferences are kind of equivalent to 3-star journals, and that's another important point, so you might not just exclude conference papers completely.
But this is where your advisor and the topic specialist can really come in handy, because they will be able to tell you what are the quality sources that you should be looking at.
Yeah, for example, like one of the things that I do is kind of data science of smart cities, and there is an IEEE conference on smart cities that happens regularly. So normally we would not include, if we were doing an SLR on smart cities, we would not include unpublished papers, but we might want to include papers from flagship conference, like that into our SLR.
So the relevance for the review questions can be a separate table. And here, for example, is mine from that time. So we have the types of visual analytics in my case, and I have inclusion and exclusion criteria for the specific questions. So I would include them if the paper references any type of visual analytics, and I would not include them if there is nothing mentioned about any visual analytics within that paper. Even if I pick them up based on keywords, if there is no mention of that, I wouldn't include that. So this is an example. Example for quality appraisal. So you can have a ranking. So you can basically assess each paper based on a set of questions. And here you can see if you can assign a criteria, if you have a scale, if you can weight it.
So this ranking is different from the ranking that we've talked about before. So this is the ranking that you perform based on what you read.
So imagine that you had to score each paper, and you will be working almost like a reviewer. Of course, this is extremely hard to do as a student if you don't know much about the field. But let's assume that you can do this properly and you will know how to do it. You basically assess all the papers that you get against this set of criteria, and you have, is the purpose adequately established? Is there a discussion and a description about the practical implication? And this is relatively easy to answer. It's either there or not, and whether the paper dedicates enough attention to that or not. So you can definitely rank that. And when you assign those scores, you can then have a cutoff of how many points each paper needs to have in order to be included. So this is another chance for you to actually narrow down your search to a manageable set, because this is not yet the final core set. So this is still a selection process. Data extraction is basically getting all the information you need to answer your review questions. So you collect basic stuff on citation, you collect basic information on the study background, you collect information about the methodology that has been used, then what has been the contribution, and finally the synthesis. You basically make a small summary of each paper. This is quite effortful. Be very strategic about what fields are you extracting, what type of information are you extracting. If you can get direct citations and make note of the page numbers because you might need them later.
Mm-hmm.
But ideally, all those questions should be serving you in a way to answer your review questions. If your review question asks for something and your data extraction doesn't cover anything related to that, you're missing on that element. So it needs to be included. So keep that in mind. Your objectives are aligned with your review questions, and your review questions are aligned with everything else, especially with extraction. So you need to extract information that can help you answering your review questions. Very important. And many people fail at this stage.
Mm-hmm. And the important part here is having the list.
Yes, yeah. It needs to be explicit. It needs to be in your protocol.
Mm-hmm.
And you actually need to answer each one of those points. It's not enough to have this list and not perform this extraction for each of the papers you work with. And also, they need to be in your appendix. So this is something that needs to be included in your appendix. You end up with a very large appendix, but it needs to be there because this is evidence.
Mm-hmm.
And this is what we call the track of evidence that you can then go back and use to warrant any claim you make further. This is what my data extraction looked like together with the quality appraisal. So I had the different rankings, I had all the information, I had direct citations copy pasted from the papers with the page numbers. It's too small to be readable, but this was a large table that I built for each one of the papers. Each line is one paper. Each column is one of the fields from my data extraction. This is quite effortful, but if you do it, you can then analyze it further very easily.
Yeah, because obviously you have filtering criteria there, and yeah, you can just quickly look up what you found. Because believe it or not, but you will forget, even if you're reading 40 papers, you will forget who said what and what was the point of the paper and all that. But yeah, also, don't just rely on your memory.
Yeah, and also even if you rely on your memory, what will you put in your appendix? What is the evidence that you did it?
Okay, yes, so of course. Yeah.
This is the evidence.
Yeah, just remember that whoever will read your paper or your thesis or your dissertation, they will only judge what they see. They cannot judge based on the stuff you read if they don't see the evidence. Yeah. If it's not in writing, then it does not exist, basically, to the reader.
Yeah. And this is not the data synthesis yet. This is just the data extraction. So I would look at it as raw data. And data synthesis is essentially transforming information that has been extracted into a smaller set. It's synthesizing, it's identifying topics, it's identifying relationships. It's basically making the previous table smaller. And how you do it? It's about reading all the bits of evidence that you collected, understanding what is the relationship between them, and try to have a coherent structure to describe that extracted data. And this is how my data synthesis looked like. So what happened was that I created nodes, nodal structures that were based on the previously extracted data. And I basically tried to simplify that nodal structure so I could have commonalities between papers. So I could analyze how two papers are alike based on those nodes. This requires much better understanding of the subject matter at this stage, but than you had before. But ideally, at this stage, you already read so many things about this specific topic that you should really know what you're reading.
Yeah, that you are becoming the subject expert a little bit. And yeah, that also actually a good table to take to your supervisor or a senior, a senior colleague who will actually help you and say, this probably isn't that relevant to what you do. And, so that's kind of, again, a point where you could seek advice from senior person.
So Here, you basically um, come up with this synthesis structure, and this will enable you to do further analysis, which we will look at next. So remember, going back to this process, we had a set of 3,000 papers, and then we ended up with 40. Those 40 were answered. Those 40 were selected from that synthesis table after we did all these steps. And when we go into chapter 4, descriptive findings, you need to keep track of what was the source of that, what was the source publication. You need to describe which trends you observe in publications. So basically, how many papers get published per year, the number of articles per journal, what are the keywords. You can show, for example, word clouds at this stage or word frequencies. You can have what is the country of origin of the first author, for example, if that's relevant to the study. What are the trends you observe in the methodology, and any other things that can be quantified in your data set. And the descriptive findings, for example, include source of publication, whether it came from EBSCO, repository, ProQuest, or Scopus in my case. Your case will look different, but this is how mine looked. Then publications per year, what is the evolution? And then you can show the reader what was the first publication to identify and what's the latest. Then, for example, which journals were the source for the publications you obtained? And in my case, for example, I got most of my papers from the European Journal of Operations Research, and I have different rankings for those. So I can show what is the breakdown in quality versus the number of papers that each journal gave me. Then have the descriptive findings in keywords, and I identify what are the top keywords that I identify in those papers. And finally, the country of origin. That's not always relevant, but might be interesting for your particular question.
Mm-hmm.
Methodology. This is a very good one to include in most papers, in most thesis, SLR thesis. And this is where you identify what method was applied in your paper. This is often quite relevant, and also you can have this breakdown by years. So if there is any interesting trend, you will identify that. So thematic analysis. So you adapt some sort of framework. Ideally, that framework has been published and is established in the field, and you can analyze themes that you identify in the papers against that framework, or you can build your own framework based on the themes that you identify. So this is the most creative part of the SLR process. So this is where you can actually build something and you analyze the themes. Here's my example. I broke it into what we call the SCORE model in operations, which is the source, make, deliver, plan, and return, the different functions that we can observe in supply chain management. And I use it as a basis to map the different papers and fields and show where those papers are contributing to. This is my example. Then I broke it down further into decision processes.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, and then I had all the articles that are concerned about those decision processes. Okay, so keep in mind that you always need to keep track of the source references that are relevant to that theme. Otherwise, you lose track of evidence.
And this is this is an example of a table that could be included in your your writing, because that's kind of gives you kind of a summary and examples of several papers per category. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and this was inside my thesis. So when I did this was part of the thesis of the main body actually. Then cross-thematic analysis. As soon as you identify all the individual themes, you can analyze what are the cross relationships, and then you can look at what papers link different themes, and this is very interesting. So in my case, I had overlaps between, for example, impact and the analytics types. And I used the papers as the metric of whether that was included or not. So the more papers mention both impact and analytics type, the greater the ranking of that intersection. And I use that as basis to show what are the key intersections, the key themes. And then I can transform those relationships into a thematic framework. So I have this cross-thematic analysis that basically builds this conception model. And I took this more artistic liberty of having the text size relevant to the frequency of those themes, but this part is more creative. But keep in mind that this is all built based on evidence, and that evidence can be tracked back to those tables that we just discussed. So this is why you need to keep track of the source material. It's not just enough to identify the theme and not say where you identify that theme. So this is what makes the SLR an SLR. Keep track of the sources. And the complete conceptual framework from my case was this one. I had the visual analytics types, then I had decision types, and what was the impact, which is exactly my review questions that I set up to answer in the beginning.
Mm-hmm.
So this is the full circle.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And the SLR concluding chapter generally looks like this. You have a review against original objectives. You have the contribution to knowledge. You have the implications for theory and practice. You have the critique, the strengths, the limitations, the further research. And you might have a personal learning section. Not all theses will have this, but you can have one. Generally, it's optional. And then you have the overall summary. And keep in mind that these conclusions assume that you answered your review questions in the previous chapter.
Mm-hmm.
Okay.
And implications for theory, implications for practice of the SLR, or
yes.
Okay. Mm-hmm.
So, and here is where you can actually define where the gaps are, if you identified any.
Mm-hmm.
What is the future research questions that you could recommend for research, etc. Your future research might be about your specific work, which is, for example, you identify a completely new field, and then you say that my future research will be to include that field in an SLR, the next one I make, and so on. So it's not always about the questions. Your questions, the formulation of further questions might be your contribution to theory and practice to identify them for future research. So keep that in mind. And finally, you need to understand that review methods are quite undeveloped. So having an SLR process makes your review literature review much better than any other non-systematic literature review. So many people actually don't have training in reviewing literature.
Yes, of course.
Yes, and most people just learn it as they do. So they have no formal training.
Yeah, and I think, the training is very rarely offered on this. And normally, I think a lot of people just rely on the supervision, as we discussed at the beginning of this video. Yeah, the danger is that very often you have one or two advisors who just give you some tips and you go away and you end up just reporting very narrowly selected and frankly quite biased literature.
And also, it's probably, it sounds bad, but never trust your supervisor to have all the answers. The supervisor has their own view, and that's their personal view. It might be an informed and a well-respected view, but it's not the absolute truth. Yeah,
and also, sometimes you can discover something interesting that's the supervisor did not necessarily think about in the first place.
Yeah. And also, supervisors often learn a lot from students. Just being a supervisor doesn't mean that they know everything. So always keep that in mind. And another thing that you will find often in literature reviews that how many unqualified statements can you find? You find big claims. You have vague statements like previous studies have shown that, or a very popular one in popular writing like Daily Mail is scientists discovered, and there is no mention of which scientist or who scientist on what they discovered, and they just make a big claim about they discovered something, and that something is very sensational, and there is no way to can actually verify that statement. So, and you find that more often than not in academic literature if it hasn't been reviewed properly. So be always wary of that, and you need to understand how to be critical about the different studies. So if it's published, it doesn't mean that it's true. You can have multiple studies being conflicting between each other. So you need to be aware of that.
Oh, you can just have false claims that are later retracted, right? And yeah, currently we see quite a few papers being retracted that were published in kind of January, February as a result of COVID, and people made some claims that are definitely not correct. And these papers are being retracted. So you need to keep in mind that it's not always not always true.
Yeah. And also, often papers will go through the review process and they will be peer reviewed and they will be published. And then suddenly someone realizes that those papers are either fake, they use fake data, or they haven't been done properly, or they have been published in multiple journals at the same time, the same paper, which are examples of poor academic practice. So you most likely will see them disappear. And if you found them on some arXiv or some database that hasn't been the official database for the journal that they've been targeting, you probably will not even notice that they have been retracted. So always find the original publisher and the original journal and make sure that those studies are still available, still there. Because you might also, and be very careful about all the preprints and any papers that you find on ResearchGate or anything that the authors released, because those releases, even if they look like a paper, they might not be actually published literature, or they might not even look like the version that got published. So remember that working papers do not count unless they're published.
Yeah, and I think this is an very important point about that the final text might look nothing like the original paper that was published on arXiv. So, and some people just don't update the arXiv paper, for example, or ResearchGate paper, simply because they just can't be bothered, or it's too much work. So maintenance is an issue, really.
And another thing is that you will see few systematic reviews in certain fields, particularly in management literature. They're starting to appear more and more, but the thing is, they are effortful and they're not very easy. Therefore, many people simply do not make them.
But that's probably the future, because with the growing body of literature in many fields, we would need some sort of filtering process where you need some like you said, replicable criteria to be applied, and people need to be able to understand where these citations come from.
But the thing is, if you look at the number of publications per year that appear, it's growing exponentially. Meaning that at some point, unless we use digital tools and we use text mining techniques and some advanced filtering, it will be nearly impossible for a human being to do literature reviews that will be comprehensive enough to include all the necessary sources.
I'm just thinking that probably at this point, the people on the other side of the screen are thinking, when are these tools coming? Like, give it to me. Because it probably is good to have a machine, but we will probably, again, tell you something that you don't want to hear. But even when machines will do topic modeling at a decent level, it still will only be the first step of your SLR. You
Yes.
still would need to critically evaluate and read and
Mhm.
everything. Like the machine will not be able to do that for you. And
Yes.
especially the machine cannot judge the relevance. It can help you to identify
Filter.
the topic
Mhm.
and filter. And the machine learning techniques will become better at this. Although, as we recently discovered with one of my colleagues, that PDF, when we need to read PDFs with the current machine learning tools, it's not that trivial, not as trivial as we thought anyway. But in any case, the tools will get better.
Mhm.
But you will always have to read still the final selection of papers and critically evaluate.
But also, one potential application of machine learning and all this computational ability is to verify the veracity of some of the claims that you identify in papers, or even verify papers based on sources, or even you can actually code the SLR process into a machine to have validation of simple claims. Imagine that they make a claim about randomized controlled trials. You can have a machine-led process that will do this verification. So it's not so far away, and this is not science fiction. It will soon be a reality.
Yeah. But the point is, like, it's still, even if we, I think if we have some part of the process automated, and the rest is probably. So we are at the end of the example now, right? And,
So, thing is, you need to be ready to perform the SLR without being overly mechanical and without being overly critical. And if you're not mechanical or not critical at the same time, we are probably lacking skill or knowledge. So we need to be both systematic and critical. And this is what makes a good high quality SLR. So the SLR needs to be focused. It needs to be transparent. It needs to be conclusive, reflective, convincing, and interesting if you can. Interesting is often hard because the mechanistic nature of the SLR can lead to rather mechanistic results. And remember that if your writing process is boring and mechanistic, it probably wasn't. If it was boring to write, it will also be boring to read. So try to make it interesting. But making it interesting doesn't mean that you need to take the creative license and make claims bigger than you can justify. So always be ready to have a systematic process following a protocol, and try to be critical and somehow entertaining as you do so, because otherwise it's just very boring.
Yeah, but I guess the kind of sticking to the subject matter and your questions might help you with that, right?
Yeah, exactly.
Because if you have an interesting questions, maybe you could also spice it up a little bit.
Yes. So if you want to know more about the SLR process, I recommend you these 3 sources. And look at them, read them.
Yeah, I can tell that two of the authors repeat, right? At the
Yes.
and Tranfeld.
Yeah. So if you are planning on doing an SLR, I wish you the best of luck. Hopefully this didn't put you off doing one, and hopefully this actually gave you some clarity about the process. And hopefully when you see someone claiming to do an SLR, you will be able to tell apart a proper SLR from something that they claim to
be an SLR. Yeah, that happens a lot.
Yeah, because often what they say is a comprehensive literature review, and they say that this is systematic. Is actually not systematic at all. So just be wary of that. And so what do you think?
Well, I mean, if you guys think that watching this video was tiring, and doing the work is probably even more tiring, because obviously I think the both of us are already tired just going through the process. But I guess what helped me in this case is seeing the example of what you've done, and how it all kind of filters into relatively small subset of papers from really large search query output. And I guess the important note that I would like to leave everybody with is that you're not alone in this journey. Many people have done SLRs previously and are doing them now and will do them in the future. And again, like Alex told us, you have a panel, like be very, like I guess the most important decision you are going to make is about your panel, the panel that is going to help you. And if your supervisor does not have enough time, then find people who have enough time to kind of help you. And in this case, you will kind of not face all these things alone, right?
And also, the great thing about SLRs is that you can actually do a thesis, a master's thesis level that only depends on you. So you don't depend on a company, you don't depend on people to respond to your survey, you don't depend on managers or experts to answer your interview. You only depend on your own effort. So if you want to do something that only depends on your work and you don't need to wait for anyone, maybe except for the panel, the SLR is the perfect methodology for a master's thesis, because it is something that you can do within a limited time frame. It's something that will definitely be, I'd say, it's not easy, but it's something that is not hard. It's just effortful. So it just takes time, but if you follow the process carefully, you can definitely do an SLR. And I always tell my students, so if you can make a simple cake following a recipe, you can definitely do an SLR. You just follow the process.
Well, I would like to thank you again for today's session. That was very, very comprehensive, much more comprehensive than anything I saw anyway on YouTube so far. And definitely not every day you hear that in the university, so very often people just are left to their own devices to do it. So thanks a lot again for doing this. And for those of you who watched this, I hope we provided enough depth into this subject. And just remember that you can always ask for help if you're doing an SLR. And keep thinking. And see you later.